We've titled our presentation, What Data are Needed to Inform Policy, and I'm going to talk a bit about publicly accessible data and secondary data analyses and the opportunities it affords, but parameters that become constraints when using data that weren't designed for the purpose of the questions you might want to ask of it. And then Paul will take over and talk about value of other secondary data sets that may not be publicly accessible, and an approach whereby we might think of connecting individuals who have quality rich data that could be have an out of field lens applied to them, as well as thinking about, you know, if we had blue sky possibility, what kind of data would we absolutely want to collect? Okay. So, I mean, I'm going to raise three big themes in my part. The first is incidence. You know, we want to know the scope of the problem. And we heard great information from Paul Weldon about that. To answer questions about incidents, we must have representative data. So the kinds of micro context data that we heard about in the first presentation, in the first session from Anna Duplessis, I mean, that's almost at the other end of the continuum, from macro to micro level, to inform system policy versus local school policy and practice. And both are needed. But if we want to know about the scope of the problem and the incidence of the problem, we must have representative data. Representative of what? So representative of some defined target population. So what target population do we actually care about? So some examples could be maths teachers in New South Wales, secondary teachers in Australian government schools. You know, what target population are we concerned about? And the sample must be representative of that for us to be able to conclude anything about incidence. And as individual researchers rarely possess the resources to obtain representative samples, for these kinds of questions, we are most certainly best off working to access existing large-scale representative data sets that we are able to use. So what do we know from these kinds of representative large data sets? So without having known in advance what Paul was going to say, I just referred to it here as a bullet. And yes, so that we know a lot actually from Paul's work with the SciAS data. And what a shame that the federal government stopped funding that, because having the questionnaire set up and having the system for collecting it set up, what a shame to have a break in that process and not really keep tracking over time. Anyway, so now I want to just give a little illustration from some of our own analyses from PISA 2015, which for the first time included a teacher survey. And Chandra Shah, are you here still? I saw you earlier.
I am here, Helen.
Great. So Chandra actually did these analyses. So, you know, I feel like a bit of an imposter presenting them for you, Chandra.
Not at all, Helen. You did a great job.
Okay. And Chandra, I was wondering if maybe you could put in the chat the web link to the full report. I've got it on the slide here, but maybe if you've got it handy, if people wanted to have the full report, because I'm only just going to give a couple of little illustrations here.
I'll try and do that. Maybe a bit later on, I might do that.
Okay, thank you. So PISA obviously is limited to grade 10 students and their teachers. So this straight away raises a number of constraints around what we can conclude. But our particular interest is in maths, which is why I've got the colouring on maths here. But this table just shows the number of teachers teaching each of these groups of subjects at year 10 in 2015, and the proportion of those teachers who were teaching it out of field. according to their definition, to our definition. So, so we constructed out of field variable from the data that were available to us within what was asked. So that was a matrix of teachers ticking which subjects that they teach at the Year 10 level, as well as they answered questions about in which subjects they had qualified to teach. So we married those up together to construct in-field and out-of-field. So I've ordered this list of subjects by the incidence of out-of-field teaching. So if you just looked at the proportions, and proportions are very useful because we've got everyone on the one metric and they're easier to think about. But if you just look at the proportions, you might think our biggest problem is ancient languages, which is almost 2/3 of teachers teaching out of field. But actually there's only 22 teachers teaching ancient languages at Year 10. So, you know, the size, so the proportion, very high, but the size, you know, maybe that wouldn't be our top priority. So we need to do this sort of balancing of size and proportion to prioritize probably. So the 21% of teachers teaching Year 10 mathematics who were teaching it out of field, that's of 2,204 teachers. So that's quite a sizable problem. Anyway, so that's just an illustration that, you know, we need to have representative data to be able to conclude anything like this. Of course, when we're using data designed and collected by others, it wasn't, you know, designed for the lens we might wish to bring to bear. So, you know, first off, we're limited to what target population that they representatively sampled. So in our case, it's only Year 10 teachers. One of our findings was that 17% of these Year 10 teachers who were qualified to teach in STEM were not doing so. And we thought, well, how interesting, but gosh, we wish that we knew about everything else that they were teaching, not just at Year 10, because maybe schools are reserving the qualified STEM teachers for upper secondary school. And so they still are teaching it, and we just didn't see it because we had Year 10. So Paul Weldon, I was fascinated in your SciS information, which does ask them about years 7 to 12, and where you still found the sizable proportion qualified to teach maths, but not doing so. Fascinating. So, I mean, it raises the issue that we're really looking at problems of supply and retention, but also resource distribution and school practices. So that's something that incidents can tell us straight away. Also, if we're interested in some subpopulation that doesn't occur very frequently in the population at large, then when we're using a secondary data analysis, it might be that our rare subpopulation, that there's not many of them in the data set. And that won't meet our needs then if we're wanting to delve down and understand Indigenous teachers in remote schools, for example. So, so that will be limiting. Obviously, we're stuck with whatever way that we're able to construct teaching out of field from the questions that were asked in the data. So the kinds of nuances that Linda particularly elaborated in session 1, we can be stuck with a rather blunt instrument for defining out of field in these data sets. We're also stuck with the level of subject aggregation that's asked. So in the PISA teacher survey, science and social studies were asked rather than particular sciences and different domains of social studies. So we can't differentiate them. So our finding from the PISA 2015 that only 6% of teachers of Year 10 science were teaching science out of field might mask more complexity there if we had been able to differentiate the different sciences. Sometimes there are embargoed analyses. So Paul Weldon, if I have this right, I think that you can't cross state with the sector or the system in SciAS, so that it wouldn't be possible, for example, to examine state territory differences of Catholic independent government schools. Is that true?
That's correct. So it's possible to look at all government schools nationally and all against all Catholic schools nationally, but it's not possible to look at Catholic schools in one state by Catholic schools in another.
Thank you. So we do have, you know, fixed parameters when we're using other people's data, but for questions of incidence, it is still the best way to go, because the paramount consideration is representativeness. The second of the three big themes is distribution. So incidence is about the scope of the problem or the issue. Distribution is about where or for whom is the problem most pronounced. And obviously questions of distribution rely on questions of incidence. So again, we must use representative data. And from our, from Chandra's analyses of the PISA 2015 data, I've just got, you know, just as much as would fit down the side of the screen. There's a lot more in the report. Some of the demographics and their associations with teaching, what did I choose? Mathematics out of field. So I've boxed the ones where it's different for the out of field from the infield. So you can see that out of field teachers, higher proportion of women than men, whereas the reverse is true for infield. For age, it seems that older teachers less likely to be teaching out of field than is the case within the infield maths teachers. So maybe these teachers have more institutional kudos and clout and are able to, you know, manage not getting assigned that way. And whereas you can see an overrepresentation of younger teachers assigned to teach maths out of field at year 10. For employment contract, this isn't going to surprise anyone, I'm really sure. More temporary teachers, a higher proportion for out of field than in field. For length of teaching experience, this was an interesting finding. We liked this finding. Actually, first year out teachers, the proportion of them out of field was lower than for in field. So we thought, oh, well, maybe the schools recognise that first year is a challenging time and they're, you know, trying not to, maybe. So that was interesting, but the greatest predominance, difference from out of field, in field was the 2 to 5 years experience range. Length of experience in current school, teachers who've been at their current school more than 5 years. The proportion assigned to teach out of field, substantially lower looking than for the distribution in field. And this might again relate to the kind of institutional clout and authority that they've built up in their time there. Anyway, so that's just an illustration of when we just simply link individual or school demographics to incidents of how we can see where and for whom we might want to delve in after understanding concentration of the issue. There are other representative data sets that could be similarly explored, and many other demographic things that could be linked, such as the TALIS, which has years 7 to 12 teachers and principals, TIMS, which delves into mathematics in year 8 and uniquely has students and their teachers. Fantastic.
5 minutes, Helen.
Oh my God, I have to stop because, all right, so antecedents and consequences. So I've already really spoken about the limitations of the antecedents, the consequences, for whom, what consequences, cross-sectional data. When we talk about a consequence, we really want the cause to precede the effect. So we really would like longitudinal data. So possibilities of data linkages are a fantastic way to go. So for example, NAPLAN numeracy happens year 7 and year 9, TIMS happens year 8. So, you know, if they could be linked, fantastic. Longitudinal data, very time and resource intensive to collect, at which point I'm really sorry, Paul, I'll pass to Paul.
Sure, no worries, Helen, thank you. I think one of the things that we would be trying to insist upon, if Helen hasn't already emphasised it, is that we really do need to think about the potential of using existing data to maximise some analyses that are possible. And it's not just for the analysis sake, it's actually to look at, as you were saying, what are the antecedents and the consequences of out of field teaching. And I think one of the things we're very conscious of at the present time is that collecting, or at least attempting to collect data from teachers and schools is a problem that I think we'll probably have to wait our time post-COVID to be able to do some of that work, if indeed someone's going to fund it. Do you want to give me? Yep. Okay, so we have a longitudinal data set, probably one of the only longitudinal data sets of teachers over the period of time. It's a long-term, we followed people from the beginning of teacher education through their teacher education, and now up to 15 years teaching, and almost 16 years now teaching by mid-career. And we could and can pull out a lot of that data, look at, for instance, out of field people in mathematics, for instance, and look at some of the long-term consequences for them as teachers, particularly in terms of their teaching style and their negotiation with students and classes. That longitudinal data set has been funded by the Australian Research Council, and we have now 4 waves of data and a large number of interviews with people as well. Networks and consortia such as this have great potential, we think, for connecting researchers who may collaboratively and collectively be able to actually look at out-of-field teaching with existing quality data sets. Until we began working with Chandra, we really had not explored that data set and its potential. And while there are limitations, it's also been really very revealing of some of the circumstances that we were able to look at, or some of the data we were able to look at in there. Currently, we have, Helen's leading a group of people from Sydney and University of Sydney, and I'm involved in that as well with the New South Wales Department of Education, who funded an investigation regarding mathematics in New South Wales government schools. And this is to try and understand, and also at the same time build some strengths and skills of non-specialist mathematics teachers. So we're looking at some of the data sets that are available to actually try and inform that project. This may be a bold suggestion, but heck, let's make it anyway. Could states and territories and systems cooperate in a national agenda? I know people in the federal government are fond of talking about national cabinets, etc. But this is the way we see it, and we make no apologies for this. We see it as a national problem. And as it was said earlier on this morning, this phenomenon is not going to go away and has been with us for a long time, and perhaps needs much greater cooperation and collaboration between the states and territories with regard to this problem. And certainly this might help to optimise the awareness and policy uptake of some of the findings. As Helen said, it was sort of terrible that the CS funding was not continued. Yeah, I mean, that's...
Paul, I'm sorry, I'll have to interrupt you there. Time's up.
Okay, all right. It's not just an Australian issue, I'm going to say at the end, though, and we need to make sure we collect some of this data as well as actually look at data collections we already have. Thank you.